During the Second World War, aircraft carriers became essential, helping to secure major victories in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and especially the Pacific. At the time, carriers were still a relatively new part of naval warfare. They had first been tested in World War I and improved during the years between the wars, leading to the successful designs used in World War II. Like any new technology, aircraft carriers had their quirks. Some were fitted with cruiser guns in case they had to fight other ships. And if that sounds surprising, the United States and Britain also swapped carriers during the war. Not only that, the first capital ship lost in World War II was a carrier. In this video, we'll take a look at 3 interesting facts about aircraft carriers during the Second World War. Starting off with cruiser guns on aircraft carriers, the idea of a big gun on an aircraft carrier dates back to the First World War, with the battle carrier hybrid HMS Furious, with their forward flying off platform and rear 18-inch gun. But things come to a head for this idea following the First World War, where nations like Britain, France, the United States, and Japan started to develop aircraft carriers, mostly conversions from the hulls of battleships or battlecruisers. Obviously, being such a new and novel concept, there was a question of where exactly the carrier would fight from. Serious consideration was given to the fact that the aircraft carriers might be in the thick of the action, barring a few exceptions in history that didn't turn out to be true. Looking at you, Formidable. Still, the designers of the 1920s didn't know that. And with fast, stealthy destroyers possibly lurking in the enemy line, or the new fast, heavily armed treaty cruisers carrying 6-inch or even 8-inch guns, it was thought that carriers would need to defend themselves from surface threats. With this in mind, the different nations in developing their various carriers gave their carriers a variety of armaments. For example, the United Kingdom, in converting Furious, Glorious, Courageous, and Eagle, they armed the carriers with guns ranging from 4.7 inches to 6 inches. Where I think it's important to quote from R.A. Burt in British Battleships 1919 to 1945, where he writes about the conversion of Courageous and Glorious. It is thought quite possible that an enemy light cruiser might break through the defense and attack the carriers. Also, during an action, the carriers might lose their position due to flying off and flying on, to such an extent that they would be liable to attack from single enemy light cruisers without being supported quickly by their own support ships. Under these circumstances, it seems essential that a carrier should be able to render a good account of herself against a contemporary light cruiser while working up her speed to rejoin her own forces. Alternatively, any commander-in-chief would be forced to detach a defensive escort for the carriers to the detriment of his offensive powers. Consideration of these forms of attack points to the desirability of an 8-inch armament for Glorious and Courageous. Granted, they didn't get 8-inch guns due to the fact that the Admiralty thought their armament was going to be sufficient along with their escort, but it shows a general thinking of the time. The various guns of these British ships were in individual mounts spread across the ship, and in their mind it gave them the best possible configuration to face attacking surface ships. Eagle, a converted Chilean battleship, a story for another time, was equipped with 6-inch guns to stop the aforementioned surface threat. That didn't stop with just conversions. One of the first purpose-built carriers, HMS Hermes, was equipped with 6 single 5.5-inch guns to deal with those same surface threats. Now, across the Channel in France, the carrier Béarn was being armed with 6-inch guns as well to combat those surface threats as well. The same goes for the Japanese carriers of the time like Akagi, but those were even bigger guns, being 8-inch guns. Some of them weren't in individual mounts like the British ships. No, my friends, they were in turrets. Granted, most of her 8-inch battery was in casemates, but she did have turrets. Here's a picture of Akagi underway in 1929 with 8-inch guns. They were there in case she was surprised by enemy cruisers and forced to give battle. I can't forget the incomplete German carrier Graf Zeppelin with her 8-inch guns. Nevertheless, my personal favorite are the American carriers of the Lexington class. Granted, I might be a little biased being American, but I think they look the best. As completed, the Lexington class was armed to repel surface as well as air attack. The only class of U.S. fleet carriers so equipped. 8 8-inch guns were fitted in 4 twin gun houses, 2 forward of the island and 2 aft of the stack. The 8-inch gun was chosen to allow the ships to deal with fast treaty cruisers. Personally, I think those are some handsome aircraft carriers, but like I mentioned previously, not many carriers ended up in range for surface combat. Again, looking at you, Formidable, it begs the question, what happened to those guns? Well, as the interwar years went on, and those powers who had aircraft carriers began to hone their doctrine, they increasingly realized that aircraft carriers weren't going to engage in surface actions. Instead, it was quite the opposite. Carriers would tend to not be in harm's way, at least in terms of surface combat. Again, looking at you, Formidable. So carriers slowly started to lose their surface guns, given the true threat of aircraft was recognized, and those guns meant for surface threats were replaced by anti-aircraft guns. Granted, some carriers still carried them in the Second World War, notably the British carriers such as Eagle. In fact, when she went down in 1942, she still had them equipped. In that same vein, when the United States joined the war, Lexington and Saratoga kept their 8-inch battery until 1942, when they were removed for something a little more practical. In the case of Saratoga, it was 16 5-inch 38 caliber guns. 8 and 4 turrets were placed where the 8-inch battery was. Sure, this arrangement was more practical given the threats to the ships, but there's just something magical about aircraft carriers being able to take on ships in a surface engagement. Next, we have an interesting concept, a carrier swap between the United Kingdom and the United States. As for a bit of background, it's autumn of 1942, and Admiral Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, faced a dilemma. The Battle of the Coral Sea in Midway and the still ongoing Guadalcanal campaign had severely weakened the U.S. fleet carrier presence in the Pacific. Lexington had been lost at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Hornet at the Battle of Santa Cruz, Wasp was torpedoed and sunk south of the Solomon Islands in September. Although it remained operational, Enterprise had been repeatedly damaged during naval engagements around Guadalcanal and would eventually require repairs back in the United States. Saratoga, which had also been damaged, was being repaired in Pearl Harbor. Ranger, although participating in the landings in North Africa, Operation Torch, she wasn't suited for combat in the Pacific due to her light construction. With the first of the Essex class not joining the fleet until 1943, the carrier situation wasn't great. Now, the United States had an ally who had been fighting the Second World War for 2 more years than she, and Admiral King, despite some portrayals about his relationship with the United Kingdom, reached out to the British. Well, he had reached out in June 1942, right after the Battle of Midway, and asked the British Admiralty to detach at least one of their carriers to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But the Royal Navy's flat tops were all engaged in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Indian Oceans. By late October, King raised the issue once again, and it quickly made its way from the British Admiralty into the personal communications between Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Thus, following Operation Torch, and despite continuous operational commitments, the Royal Navy detached HMS Victorious from the home fleet for service with the United States Navy. Ranger, although a less capable carrier, was offered in return to serve in place of Victorious in the home fleet, and the terms were accepted. I'll spare you the details of Ranger's service with the home fleet. It wasn't very exciting, since like I said, she wasn't the most capable carrier. In fact, her last combat operation came in October 1943, when she bombed German shipping near Bodo, Norway. Anyway, let's get back to Victorious. Victorious had been commissioned on March 29, 1941, and she was definitely different than her US counterparts, having a smaller air wing and fully enclosed armored hangars and an armored flight deck, along with other details we don't have time to get into. But suffice it to say, Victorious was different. Still, if she was going to serve with the US Pacific Fleet, she was going to need to conform a little. And to see that done, she went to Norfolk in December of 1942, where she had all manner of new equipment installed. Talk between ships, radar, fire control, new firefighting equipment, and of course, with it being the United States, more anti-aircraft guns. The Royal Navy crew was issued US Navy khaki dungaree shipboard working uniforms to be worn in lieu of British tropical white. She also received a new complement of Avengers. Victorious left Norfolk on February 3rd, heading for the Pacific via the Panama Canal. And while she was still a British carrier, the US Navy temporarily gave her the two-syllable call sign Robin. From the moment she sailed, the ship was basically running a floating training course with the US Navy. Intensive flight operations were carried out using American procedures, both with Martlet fighters and the much larger, still unfamiliar TBF Avengers. By the time Victorious entered the Pacific on February 14th and headed for Pearl Harbor, escorted by 3 US destroyers, the air group had already flown hundreds of sorties during the transit. This is where problems started to show up. The Avengers were a poor fit for Victorious in practice. Their arrestor hooks did not work well with British arresting wires, and the wire tension was not suited for off-center landings by such large aircraft. Several landing accidents occurred, 2 of them were fatal. On top of that, the Avengers were so heavy when fully loaded that Victorious's cranes could not lift them, and they only barely fit on the ship's elevators. Even just moving these aircraft around the flight deck took careful planning. All of this forced the Royal Navy crew to rapidly adapt to US Navy flight deck handling methods. Robin arrived at Pearl Harbor on March 4th, where the arresting gear was modified to better handle the Avengers, and the aircraft hooks were altered to catch the wires more reliably. Even with these fixes, problems continued, and a flight deck crash and fire on April 25th caused damage that had to be repaired at Pearl Harbor. Around this time, Victorious's camouflage was also painted over in US Navy Sea Blue, so she would match Saratoga, the American carrier she was about to operate with. On May 8th, Victorious sailed south with North Carolina and 2 destroyers, eventually joining Saratoga at Noumea as part of Task Force 14. At this point, Robin and Saratoga were the only operational Allied carriers in the Pacific. A false report of Japanese ships leaving Truk quickly put the task force to sea, and even though nothing came of it, this first deployment with an American task force ended up being extremely valuable. The British crew's fighter direction methods, built on hard experience in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, impressed the US Navy enough that some of these procedures were adopted. As operations continued, space limitations meant that Avengers simply did not work well on Victorious, so the 2 carriers swapped air units. Saratoga took the torpedo bombers, and Victorious operated as a pure fighter carrier. During the operation to invade New Georgia, the 2 ships provided air cover for nearly a month, keeping aircraft in the sky for hours at a time. By the time Victorious finally headed back towards Britain, the ship and her crew had gained real combat experience operating inside a US Navy task force, and just as importantly, both navies walked away having learned lessons from each other, so the swap was certainly interesting and valuable. Finally, a look at the first capital ship lost in World War II, HMS Courageous. A little bit of background on September 1st, On September 1st, 1939, the Second World War began with the German invasion of Poland. In response to that, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. The Germans had already sent several surface ships, including the Admiral Graf Spee, into position to attack Allied shipping. The Kriegsmarine also ordered out U-boats to do a similar job. With the U-boat campaigns of the First World War of recent memory, the Royal Navy had several strategies to deal with these underwater threats. The first being the convoy system, in which merchant ships gathered together and traveled as a group under the escort of warships equipped to deal with the U-boat threat. One of those tools developed to help counter this threat would be ASDIC, otherwise known as sonar. Although having a limited range, it was adequate for ships escorting convoys, as they were able to position themselves around the merchant ships and hopefully be able to locate the approaching U-boat before it sank any of the ships. Another strategy the Royal Navy employed would be through the use of aircraft to spot U-boats moving into the Atlantic, although the newer U-boats would have the fuel capacity to reach the Atlantic by going around the north of Scotland. The last strategy, which will play a crucial role in our story, is the Carrier Hunter-Killer Group, consisting of an aircraft carrier and her escorting destroyers. The aircraft would patrol a large area of sea, and if they spotted a U-boat, some of the destroyers would race off and help attack the U-boat. However, there were other such hunter-killer groups consisting of cruisers that were meant to deal with surface threats. But, On September 17th, HMS Courageous was off the southwest coast of Ireland conducting such an offensive air operation against U-boats, when she was sunk by U-29. On September 16th, Courageous sailed from Plymouth, escorted by 4 destroyers, to carry out offensive air operations against enemy submarines off the southwestern coast of Ireland. The reason being, this area was a critical component of the so-called Western Approaches, where a majority of Britain's shipping ports were located. The next afternoon, on the 17th, Courageous was steaming westward at high speed to catch up with aircraft that had taken off at 4:15 p.m. to attack a U-boat that was shelling the merchant vessel SS Kafiristan. When the strike group of aircraft left, 2 of the escorting destroyers, Inglefeld and Intrepid, raced ahead to assist the hunt for the offending submarine, leaving Courageous with only Ivanhoe on her port side and Impulsive on her starboard bow. At about 7:20 that night, Courageous turned onto a southeasterly course into the wind to reduce speed to help the striking force to land. 35 minutes later, at 7:55, 2 large explosions in rapid succession could be heard and felt throughout the ship. All the lights in the ship went dark, and she began to list heavily to port. The attacker was a German U-boat, U-29, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Otto Schuott. U-29 had been at sea for several weeks and was returning to Germany through the English Channel. Around 6 p.m., Schuott spotted the carrier group and began to pursue it, not being in a favorable enough position to attack the carrier until she turned onto a southeasterly course to recover her aircraft. U-29 fired a spread of 3 torpedoes, with 2 of them striking Courageous, one of the torpedoes striking just abreast of the petty officer's flat, and the other at the after end of B boiler room. Following this, HMS Ivanhoe turned to attack and drop depth charges. Meanwhile, HMS Impulsive headed to the starboard bow and dropped astern to pick up men abandoning the ship. However, U-29 made its escape, being vigorously hunted until past midnight, and returned to Germany. After that, her captain received the Iron Cross First Class, and the crew received the Iron Cross Second Class. Back on board Courageous, following the 2 explosions, the lights went out, and the ship immediately took on a heavy list. As the power went out almost immediately, the Typhon siren started and could not be stopped. The quartermaster reported that the ship had lost all steering. Following this, Captain W.T. Makig Jones ordered that the ship's position be sent out, while the signal books were being collected for destruction. At 8:05 p.m., loud crashing noises were heard, these most likely being bulkheads collapsing, and the ship took on an even more prominent list of about 35 degrees. Captain Makig Jones ordered that the international code signal, "Stand by me," be hoisted, and said that anyone who wished to leave the ship was at liberty to do so. On the upper decks, all boats except sea boats were turned in and secured. Due to the severe list, no boats on the starboard side, except the cutter, could be lowered, which had apparently sustained damage and became waterlogged shortly after being lowered into the water. Other boats on the port side were lowered by some ratings, along with Carley floats. Things like gratings and loose woodwork were tossed into the water to assist the men in treading water. Between decks, all important watertight doors had been closed, but due to the heavy list and without power, it was impossible to close the remaining doors. Shortly after the explosion, the captain had ordered that the starboard bulges be flooded, but the order did not get through. Still, Lieutenant Sedgwick, along with 2 other men, proceeded to the Z Seacock and attempted to flood the starboard bulge, but due to the explosion, they were unable to do so. In the hangars, the few officers and men who were there when the torpedoes struck were able to escape, although personnel in the lower hangar had difficulty in forcing a way through the fire curtains as they had been jammed. Lieutenant Shenton was on watch in the forward center engine room where, after the explosion and the loss of power, he ordered that the starboard engines be stopped and ordered the engine room's evacuation. As steam was falling rapidly with a considerable steam leak, Shenton operated the emergency bulkhead valve, closed the lever, and rang the sprayer telegraphs to 0. As for the other engine room, a stoker came from the boiler room with his overalls on fire and could give no information. Other men who came up could give no information either. It would take only about 20 minutes for Courageous to go down, taking over 500 men down with her, including Captain Making Jones, as well as the ferry Swordfish aircraft of the 811th and 822nd Air Squadrons. As Impulsive was rescuing survivors, she was soon joined by the American merchant ship Collingsworth, the British merchant ship Dido, and the Dutch passenger ship Veendam, which launched 14 lifeboats. But the rescue work would prove difficult as the sea was covered in oil. Further help arrived as other Royal Navy ships came. Taking from HMS Courageous 1939, Eyewitnesses of World War II, we'll take a look at the account of Sub-Lieutenant I.F. West Maycott. This account was originally printed in the Daily Telegraph about a week after the sinking of Courageous. Paymaster Sub-Lieutenant I.F. West Maycott, the captain's secretary, was having his supper in the Courageous when he heard 2 explosions, which seemed to lift the ship. All lights went out and crockery fell over, he continued. I got out of the wardroom and made my way to the seaplane platform on the top of the quarterdeck. People waiting there did not seem to realize that the ship would sink soon. Suddenly, an order was given for everyone to get into the water. Some men went to the floats and others got boats out. I stripped and jumped into the water. I was in about 40 minutes, swimming all the time, until I reached one of the destroyers. Everybody behaved with a calm and the men cracked jokes. There was no panic or disorder. Almost immediately after the attack, the Courageous began to list to port, and within 5 minutes, the captain gave the order to abandon her. Her bows were submerged, her stern cocked up into the air, and she foundered within 15 to 20 minutes of being hit. The ship that had succeeded Courageous in the home fleet, Ark Royal, also went on to do these anti-submarine patrols and was attacked by a U-boat, U-39, but survived her attack. With the sinking of Courageous, and with Ark Royal almost suffering the same fate, the Admiralty soon decided that the carriers were far too valuable to risk in such patrols, and the Carrier Hunter-Killer Group concept was abandoned for the time being. This iteration of the Carrier Hunter-Killer Group was certainly one of First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's less successful ideas. Well, there you have it, folks. And I know what some of you are thinking. Why am I seeing this guy for the first time? Well, it's actually pretty simple. YouTube's changing, and it's kind of a do or die moment for the channel. I need to adapt or die, and I'm choosing to adapt. So this isn't going to be an every week thing where you're seeing my face, but it's going to be something that's going to be a little more common. So I hope you get used to my ugly mug. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.